Uh, Today I will conclude my ongoing lecture on sociology of knowledge. Now, sociology of knowledge became, after the Second World War, a new area of special. I'm sorry. Now I am audible. Today I will continue my lecture, which I began on Monday, namely the new area, sociology of knowledge, which emerged after the Second World War as an attempt to synthesize the Marxist classical sociology with the Durkheimian classical sociology, primarily by the people associated with the Second and Third World, but very reluctantly the First World also conceded the ground because they had no other option. Now, I am quoting from Blackwell Dictionary of Sociology, page number 1965 and 1966. Karl Marx argued that ruling economic classes shape knowledge in ways that promote their interests over those of subordinate classes. For example, the idea that wealth results from hard work or economic enterprise taking risk, popularized by First World ideologue Max Weber and canonized by the high priest Talcott Parsons. The Second World people are articulating sociology of knowledge, where both the Marxist notion of knowledge and Durkheimian theory of knowledge becomes complementary components of an integrated theory of knowledge. At the moment, we are trying to understand the point of view of Karl Marx and not the Marxist high priest like Friedrich Engels, Vladimir Lenin, Joseph Stalin, or Chairman Mao. Rather, we are relying on the academic Marxists like T.B. Baltimore, Ernest Gellner, and also people like Louis Althusser and Maurice Godelier, and also people like Karl Mannheim. Now, the major difference between Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels can be summarized into 2 points. Number one, Karl Marx remains the theorist of dialectical materialism, but he does not articulate himself the complementary theory developed by his friend and collaborator Friedrich Engels and his disciples like Lenin, Stalin, Mao, and people associated with Socialist International in Western Europe. Now, Friedrich Engels did not falsify the concept of dialectical materialism. Rather, he gives it a new height by publishing his personal book, Dialectics of Nature. But he also develops 2 new theories. One is called historical materialism, which has become Marxist orthodoxy following Friedrich Engels' work Anti-Dühring, and also the subsequent simplified version of it, socialism, utopian versus scientific. In other words, we can say with certainty on the basis of new translations which are considered much more authentic and faithful by the academic Marxists, that Marx remained a dialectician, namely he believed in dialectical materialism not only in his earlier works like economic and philosophical manuscripts, but also in the representative work of mature Marx or later Marx, which was published in his own lifetime, namely Das Kapital. Now, in German, DAS KAPITAL, Das Kapital, becomes in English simply capital, not with K but C, CAPITAL. Now, what is the criticism over his friend Friedrich Engels? One criticism is that Marx neither believed in historical materialism as a dogma or as a predictive theory of the movement of history from primitive communism to feudalism to capitalism to 3 stages of socialism. he just propounded an idea, a hypothesis based on his dialectical materialism that there is transformation of society or social formations on the basis of dialectical relationship between the means of productions and relations of productions. In other words, Marx never said, as Friedrich Engels articulated after his death, that it will be always the means of productions which will determine the relations of productions. In other words, he neither believed in economic determinism nor in technological determinism, which is the running theme of Marxist orthodoxy in politics and economics. Marx just said that there is a dialectical relationship between means of productions which include land, labor, capital, enterprise, technology, the structure of production, the network of distribution, and the fashion of consumption on the one hand. On the other, there are relations of productions. Now, we must wait here and think about the substantive theory which not only Engels and his disciples but Marx was also trying to articulate in the Communist Manifesto of 1848. This is not part of the theoretical argument, but this is certainly part of the substantive argument of the Communist Manifesto, that among other things, Karl Marx was fighting for less number of hours for workers. Namely, Marx was claiming that this is unethical on the side of the management controlled by those who controlled the means of productions to take work from the workers more than 12 hours a day and 6 days a week. Now, I do not think that the opponents of Marx are correct by pointing out that the demand of Karl Marx was successfully implemented in the capitalist countries, but it was not implemented in the socialist countries of Soviet Union and China, because they are missing the main point which Karl Marx was trying to argue. He was just trying to say that when the class in itself will become class in itself. Class, in itself is what? That you work in a factory and with your fellow workers, you are the working class. But you are just class in itself. It does not make you a revolutionary force unless and until you are conscious of it, that you are fellow workers having similar interest in the factory. When you become conscious of your common interest and you are ready to fight to safeguard your rights, and you are ready to fight for the genuine wage, then you become class for itself, and then it becomes a revolutionary force. But it was just an example which he gave, that, for example, workers should not be pressurized to work for more than 12 hours in a day. Of course, the opponents are right that soon after the death of Marx, in the Western European countries, capitalists, more to safeguard the spread of socialism or the socialist idea than to help the workers, decreased the working hours from 18 hours to 8-10 hours. And first, the Sunday was declared a holiday, and then gradually there was demand to implement Saturday also as a holiday. Now let us come to the point what the academic Marxists are trying to underline. I will repeat the same sentence without including the explanatory sentences which I used. Marx argued that ruling economic classes shape knowledge in ways that promote their interests over those of subordinate classes. Now, as we see, in this sentence, there is nothing to support economic determinism. Marx is not saying that this is the economic background of the ruling class which shapes knowledge. Rather, he is trying to argue that ruling economic classes shape knowledge. It is not the economic background, the economic foundation, their control of the means of production, which is automatically giving birth to knowledge to promote their own interests. Rather, ruling class people become a different semi-autonomous category, and their control over the means of production becomes complementary. In other words, Marx is not trying to say that social formations or economic conditions will automatically create a new type of consciousness among the ruling classes or the working classes. Rather, he is just trying to articulate what Newton was trying to articulate, some sort of affinity, causal affinity or electivity. In other words, there is a more or there is a higher chance, there is a higher probability that people of ruling class will try to promote their self-interest, because they are not only class in itself, but they are also class for themselves. In other words, Marx is trying to argue that the ruling class does not own simply the means of productions, but they are also class for itself. They are also class for itself because of, to borrow from Pierre Bourdieu, because of their cultural capital. In other words, there is no direct, relationship, there is no causal relationship between the means of production's ownership and a particular type of class consciousness. Rather, it is mediated by a culture of knowledge gathering and knowledge dissemination. In other words, Marx is trying to say that there are two things. There is a base or infrastructure and there is a superstructure. Now, what is base or infrastructure? The base or infrastructure is not only the ownership of means of productions, rather the infrastructure is the dialectical relationship between the means of productions on the one hand and the relations of productions on the other, where the knowledge dissemination or knowledge distribution agencies play a very important mediating role. As a result, Karl Marx advocated a need of developing working class or labor class consciousness, and to perform this act of mediation, he propagated the idea of the Communist Party, which chief role will be to provide working knowledge of class interests among the working classes of the Western European industrial factories. Second, Marx was trying to, falsify the long-held view among the political economists, beginning with Adam Smith, that the creation of wealth or accumulation of wealth is more a result of the hard work of the entrepreneurial class. Adam Smith differentiates between the business class and the entrepreneurial class. The business class is merely interested in augmenting profit, but the industrial class or the entrepreneurial class is not only interested in making profit, rather it is also interested in perpetuating this profit as a lifelong process by making the profit as capital. Capital is that profit or wealth which is reinvested for further production and further profit. Therefore, the difference between wealth and capital must be understood. In other words, Adam Smith is trying to say that the business class has less faith in risk taking. They are more interested in pragmatic or opportunistic investment for short-term profit, whereas the entrepreneurial class is more interested in long-term profit. And for this, what they do, they not only make profit, but they lead a very, very frugal life. They do not indulge in luxury the way business class indulges in. Rather, they follow some sort of this worldly asceticism, because in case you are indulging in luxury, then your wealth will not be available for further investment in, more production of goods and services. In other words, Adam Smith was implicitly trying to argue what Max Weber and early Talcott Parsons tried to argue explicitly. What both of them argued, Max Weber in Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, and Talcott Parsons in the Structure of Social Action, they were trying to argue that capitalism emerged as a unique phenomenon in Western Europe because of a Protestant ethic which promotes hard work on the one hand, and it also promotes a very, very simple life or this worldly asceticism, and this is the root of, the accumulated wealth of the capitalist. Marx is trying to falsify this argument in Capital Volume 1, and he is claiming that the idea that wealth results from hard work rather than from inheritance, luck, or various forms of market manipulation needs a new interrogation. In other words, Marx is trying to say what Durkheim, and more than Durkheim, his disciple Lévi-Strauss said, that what is propagating as a theory of capitalism or the theory of wealth accumulation is not a very, very honest, impartial, very neutral. It is a propaganda, it is a myth. Marx did not say it the way Lévi-Strauss articulated it in The Savage Mind, or Durkheim articulated in Suicide and Professional Ethics and Civic Morals, but he is definitely challenging the view of Adam Smith, because then Max Weber was not writing. Marx died in 1883, and major works of Max Weber in political economy emerged after 1900. He died in 1920. Only in the last 20 years he wrote about economy and society. Earlier he was writing about law, he was writing about jurisprudence. Therefore, there was no Max Weber, therefore the critique is not of Max Weber, rather of Adam Smith and Ricardo and other political economists who were writing before Karl Marx. Marx is trying to say, which Wilfred also articulated in Mind and Society, that the creation of wealth in capitalism is not a very, very scientific process, which can be said as a rational legal phenomenon. Rather, there are residues or, emotional, non-rational, manipulative actions which lead to wealth accumulation, but then there is a derivation or, a post facto explanation by the social scientists. Reading once more, the idea that wealth results from hard work rather than from inheritance, luck, or various forms of market manipulation serves the interest of the dominant classes in capitalist society. Second, following Marx, Karl Mannheim argued that the social basis for knowledge is much broader than the economic forces that form the core of Marx's approach. Third, economic determinism as a dogma is not part of dialectical materialism. Is not part of dialectical materialism. Now, I am, continuing my the last two lectures, and this is a prepared text I am reading out. The story of modern economics or the British political economy begins in 1776 with the publication of Adam Smith's The Wealth of the Nation. It was the most important English non-fiction after Thomas Hobbes' 1651 book Leviathan. Thomas Hobbes called man selfish, nasty, and brutish by nature, and also emphasized the life of a man as solitary, poor, and short. Of course, he was not aware about non-European countries much, and he was referring to Western Europe in particular. During this period, for common man of Europe in general and United Kingdom in particular, little changed over the centuries after the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. Real per capita wages were virtually the same year after year, decade after decade. During this age, the average lifespan of European people was a mere 40 years. Then came 1776, when hope and rising expectations were extended to the common working man of United Kingdom for the first time. Please remember, they had started looting the most prosperous, most healthy, most literate, most civilized nation of 18th century India since 1757. As Andre Gunder Frank has documented in his Reorient 1998, as well as Tapan Rai Chaudhary and Irfan Habib had demonstrated in the Cambridge Economic History of India, Volume 1, 1982, or as historian Dharampal had provided, the British evidence of the India until 18th century by spending long years in the British archives in London in his 7 books, which were published between 1962 and 1983. In case you are interested to know the name of the books, not necessarily in chronological order, but in the order of influence, the 7 books are The Beautiful Tree, Indigenous Indian Education in 18th Century, 1983. Second, The British Origin of Cow Slaughter in India, with some British documents on the anti-kine killing movement of 1880 and 1894. It was published in 2003. Understanding Gandhi, 2003. Panchayati Raj as the basis of Indian polity, 1962. Civil disobedience and Indian tradition, 1971. Indian science and tradition in 18th century India, 1971. And last, the Madras Panchayat system, 1971. India was the most developed economic powerhouse of the world economy until 18th century. European nations since 16th century were developing countries until 18th century, which they call to third world. In other words, until 18th century, most developed European nations were developing countries like the third world countries are supposed to develop after the Second World War. And in case you wanted to look at the title of a very interesting book, the book is named When Asia Was the World, Stewart Gordon. When Asia was the world. European nations since 16th century were very poor until 16th century. European nations were very poor from 4th century till 16th century. It is only in the 16th century that they started developing, but then they were far, far behind the powerhouse of global economy until 18th century, that was Asia. European nations since 16th century were developing countries till 18th century, even after the colonization of American continents, Africa, Australia. England, France and Germany were not even front runners among the developing countries of the Western Europe. I am repeating because this is terribly important to understand what type of theoretical propaganda Max Weber and his disciples like early Talbot Parsons were making, and it is consumed in much of the third world countries even today. European nations since 16th century were developing countries till 18th century, even after their colonization of American continents since Ghana, colonization of American continents, Africa and Australia, and who are those developing countries? Spain, Portugal, Netherlands, Italy, and to some extent Catholic France. England, the Protestant France, and Protestant Germany were not even front runners among the developing countries of the Western Europe. After they started exploiting the developed Asian countries by the middle of 18th century, the English and French workers looked forward to obtaining a basic minimum of food, shelter, and clothing. Even tea, previously a luxury, had become a common beverage. This is from Mark Asquin, which I had shown to you, where he is dealing with Adam Smith, Keynes, and Karl Marx. Now let us conclude. First, European modernity, since the time of Voltaire, particularly his play Brutus, which played the most important role in the French Revolution, as well as Shakespeare. I am repeating, European modernity since the time of Voltaire and Shakespeare is as much a grand spectacle of art, including mechanical productions of industrial art and grand architecture and sculpture, as it is a scientific and academic narrative of grand theorists. Second, after two hot wars, the First World War, which began in 1914 and ended in 1919, and the Second World War, which began in 1939 and ended in 1945, there was a long period of Cold War between NATO group led by United States of America and their intellectual representative Talcott Parsons, and countries associated with Warsaw Pact, that is the Second World, under the leadership of USSR, and their ideologue emerges to be none other than Joseph Stalin. Now the Cold War had many stages, and I am reading out from 1945 till the Vietnam War and the beginning of postmodernism, that is 1968-69, then from 1968-69 till the Iranian Revolution of 1979, then from 1979 of Iranian Revolution, in which France played a very important role. Please remember, Ayatollah Khomeini, the supreme leader of Iranian Revolution of 1979, had taken his center in France, and a terrorist attack on the huge towers till September 2007. This is the period the stagflation began in the United States, and it spread in other parts of the world, excluding China and India, in 2008 till 2015-16. In 2015, in the month of September, Vladimir Putin of Russia intervened in the Syrian crisis, and for the first time after the Second World War, NATO countries were forced to retreat. And who was the president? Barack Obama. Then Brexit, United Kingdom voted for Brexit or exit of Britain from the European Union in May 2016, and it was completed from 1st January 2021. And then now we come to Corona pandemic from 24th December 2019, and it is continuing today. My conclusion is the world in 2020-21 looks like the world in 1911, 1913, that is, it is structurally homologous in theory and practice to the time before First World War. Now the question is, why they fight? First, why they fight the hot war or cold war as geopolitical forces or in academic theories? Why do they fight? They fight to have monopoly over the power to theorize the world according to their geopolitical interest under the light of civilizational legacy. Here you can find the echo of Karl Marx. Why do they fight? They fight to have monopoly over the power to theorize the world according to their geopolitical interest. Marx was talking about ruling class interest. I am talking about geopolitical interests of the first world countries and the second world countries. Why do they fight? Why can they fight between Talcott Parsons and Bukharin? Why there is a fight between Robert Nisbet and Tom Baltimore? Why they unite? And why there is another fight? Because the first world people and the second world people, they want to have monopoly over the power to theorize the world according to their geopolitical interests under the light of civilizational legacy. Second, what is theory? To construct a theory of reality, that is ontology, as well as to construct a theory of knowledge, that is epistemology, theory in quotes, theory is used as the highest order of weapon to monopolize systems of thought and structures of political economy. Theory in social sciences as well as in natural sciences is used as the highest order of weapon to monopolize systems of thought and structures of political economy. Third, what is the function of theory? The function of theory is to provide meaning in quotes of the world. The function of theory is to provide meaning of the world and the purpose of human life, and they call it rational legal thinking. Fourth, what is the methodology of these warring theorists? The methodology of theoretical war, is to formulate research design to falsify rivals' concepts of the world, history, that is time, and territory, that is space, on the one hand, and on the other, there is a systematic operational strategy to verify one's own concepts of the world, history, and territory. Now, let us come to the Marshall Plan, which I was referring to. The Marshall Plan after the Second World War began with a budget of 15 billion package. Now $15 billion in 1945 was a very huge sum in contemporary language of dollar. And what were the goals of this Marshall Plan? The goals were four. First, to rebuild war-torn regions. In other words, to create a huge European market for American goods and services. That was the first goal, to rebuild war-torn regions. They said, we are helping you, we are giving you aids, but in the name of aids, in the name of help, in the name of, loan, what they were trying to do? They were trying to create a new market for the American goods and services. Second, the second goal of Marshall Plan was to remove trade barriers between the nations. Now, they are talking the same thing which people are talking in the name of globalization after 1991. And what is the date? The date is 1945. Please remember. And third, to modernize the world according to the American vision. To modernize the world according to the American vision. And fourth, to prevent the spread of communism that they called virus, contagious virus in the first world and third world. To promote their four goals, Talcott Parsons, the high priest of the NATO countries, proposed patterned variables, which all of you must have read in your graduation. And he proposed the theory of modernization. He proposed, projects for development. He proposed huge research grants to third world academicians. He proposed academic exchange program. And what was the goal? The goal was to make the United States of America as the highest desire of every human being on earth. Now, unfortunately for them, there was a rupture. There was a rupture. And what was the rupture? The rupture was that just after they tried to consolidate in academia, after 1945, just 4 years after that, just 2 years before the social system was published, a French gentleman, namely Claude Lévi-Strauss, born in 1908 and died in 2009, published the elementary structures of kinship in 1949. Then in 1955, he published his second major work, Triste Tropics. In 1962, he published The Savage Mind, in which he claimed two things. Number one, what the Europeans call the scientific history is nothing but a modern myth created by the utilitarian philosophers and the pragmatic historians to cover up their exploitation, to cover up their manipulation. Otherwise, the savage mind is structurally equivalent to the American mind. He said the human mind anatomically or physiologically is the same everywhere, and it also functions everywhere in the same way. And therefore, the cultural superiority or economic or political superiority is a historical development which should be interrogated in space and time. It should not be propounded as a grand theory of the world and cosmos. Thank you.